Hello, my name is Mike. I'm 45, and until recently, I thought I was living the life most guys my age dream of. I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 18 years. We've got two amazing kids, a cozy suburban home, and the kind of routine that feels like a warm blanket on a cold day, predictable, comforting, and safe. At least, that's what I thought. Last Saturday, while I was scrolling through my news feed with a cup of coffee in hand, Emily dropped a bombshell that shattered the monotony of our comfortable lives. It was early, the kids were still asleep, and the sun barely peeked through the curtains when she sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Her face was calm, too calm, and she opened with, "Mike, I need to talk to you about something." Now, if you've been married as long as I have, you know that phrase rarely leads to anything good. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "I've been feeling stuck lately," she said, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug. "And I think I need to explore who I am outside of this marriage." I blinked. "What are you talking about, Emily? We've got a life here. A family. You're not stuck. We've built this together." "I know," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "But I've been reading this book about relationships, and it talks about rediscovering yourself to strengthen your marriage. One of the exercises it suggests is going on a date with someone new." My brain short-circuited. "Wait, are you asking to date other people?" "Not date," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Just one date. It's about reconnecting with who I was before I became a wife and a mom." I laughed, thinking it had to be a joke. When her face didn't change, the laugh caught in my throat. "Emily, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "It's not ridiculous," she said sharply. "It's introspective. And it's not like I'm asking for permission. I just wanted to let you know." The days that followed. Her words stuck with me like gum on the bottom of a shoe. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I tried to bring it up, she either brushed it off or acted like I was overreacting. "It's one night, Mike," she said on Wednesday when I finally cornered her. "I don't even know if I'll actually go through with it. It's just a thought." But it didn't feel like just a thought. It felt like a grenade with the pin half pulled, and I was the one holding it. And her casual attitude only made it worse. Emily had always been the level-headed one in our marriage, the rock. Now she was acting like someone I didn't recognize. An unexpected ally. On Friday evening, I was pacing the backyard when my neighbor, Tom, poked his head over the fence. Tom's the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back. Retired Army, straight shooter, always good for a beer and some no-nonsense advice. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, handing me a cold one. I sighed and told him everything. To my surprise, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he leaned on the fence and said, "You ever hear about a midlife crisis, Mike? Sounds like your wife's got one brewing. But this dating experiment crap? Nah. That's trouble. Tell me something I don't know, Tom," I muttered. He nodded thoughtfully. "You've got two options. Sit back and let her do this, or get ahead of it. Show her why she doesn't need some so-called self-discovery date. Remind her of who you are." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," he said, his voice low, "you fight for your marriage. You don't let some dime store psychology book wreck what you built." The turning point. Inspired by Tom's words, I decided to take action. That night, I made a reservation at the Italian place where Emily and I had our first date. I figured if she wanted to remember who she was before the kids and the routines, I'd show her the version of us that made her fall in love in the first place. But when I told her about my plan, she shook her head. "That's sweet, Mike. But it's not the same. I need to do this for me." My stomach twisted. She was serious about this. dead serious. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a passing whim. Emily was drifting into dangerous waters. And if she thought I was going to stand by and watch her unravel our life together, she had another thing coming. Before last week, if someone had asked me to describe my marriage, I would have said it was solid. Not perfect, no marriage is, but strong enough to weather life's ups and downs. Emily and I had been through so much together. We met in college, back when I was a scrappy business major who barely scraped by, and she was the bright-eyed psychology student who always had her nose in a book. We got married young, at 27, and we were broke for the first few years. Emily worked as a social worker, and I bounced between jobs until I started my own construction business. It was a grind, but we were happy, or so I thought. We had our first child, Sophie, 5 years into our marriage, and then little Ethan came along 2 years after that. Life got busier, Messier. There were late-night feedings, diaper blowouts, and endless schedules to juggle. Emily stepped away from her job to focus on raising the kids, and I took on extra work to make sure we could pay the bills. Somewhere in all of that, I guess we forgot to focus on us. But you know what? There were some of the warning signs I missed. Looking back now, I can see there were cracks forming for years, but I ignored them because that's what guys like me do. You think, we're busy. This is normal. Things will get better. Emily stopped smiling as much. She always looked tired, even after the kids started school. When I came home from work, she'd barely look up from whatever she was doing, folding laundry, cooking dinner, scrolling on her phone. At the time, I thought she was just overwhelmed with mom life. I'd ask her what was wrong, but she'd wave me off with a nothing or a half-hearted, "I'm fine." She'd always been the center of our family, but over the past couple of years, it was like a part of her was slipping away. I chalked it up to the grind of parenthood and the wear and tear of 18 years together. But now I'm wondering if she felt like I wasn't paying attention. Here's the thing, I worked hard. Harder than I probably needed to, if I'm being honest. I had this idea that my role as a husband and dad was to provide. Emily never complained about me being gone late or taking extra jobs on weekends, but I'm starting to think that was part of the problem. She didn't complain because she stopped expecting anything from me. She's told me before that she felt like she was losing herself in our marriage, but I always dismissed it as her being dramatic. "What do you mean, Em?" I'd say, "You're a great mom, and we've got a good life. Isn't that enough?" But maybe it wasn't. She went back to school a few years ago, taking online classes in psychology. At the time, I thought it was just a hobby, something to keep her busy while the kids were in school. Now, I realize it was probably her way of trying to find herself again. She even started volunteering at a local counseling center last year, but I barely noticed. I was too caught up in work to see what was right in front of me. I guess if you really look at it, this thing she wants, this date to rediscover herself, didn't come out of nowhere. It's the result of years of her feeling stuck while I buried my head in work. It doesn't excuse it, though. I mean, I've worked just as hard for this family. I've sacrificed just as much. But I never thought I'd wake up one day to my wife telling me she wanted to date someone else as a way to reconnect with herself. That part still burns. The truth is, I miss the Emily I fell in love with. The one who danced in the kitchen while she cooked spaghetti, who could quote the Princess Bride line for line, who'd spend hours dreaming with me about the life we wanted to build. That version of her feels so far away now. But maybe it's not just her that's changed. Maybe I've changed too. I used to be the guy who left her love notes on the bathroom mirror, who brought home flowers for no reason, who couldn't wait to spend every second with her. Now I come home, eat dinner in front of the TV, and crash in bed without even asking how her day was. Maybe I've been stuck too. So yeah, I can see why Emily might be looking for someone else to make her feel alive again. But it still feels like a slap in the face. Why couldn't she just come to me and say, Mike, I'm not happy? Why does her solution have to involve going on a date with another guy? And here's the kicker. Part of me is terrified she's already got someone in mind. She hasn't said it outright, but the way she's been acting lately, hiding her phone, going out more, dressing up even when she's just running errands, it doesn't sit right with me. I don't know if I'm being paranoid or if there's something more going on, but one thing's for sure, this isn't just about self-discovery. I can feel it in my gut. Now let's get back to that after night morning. I decided to try a different approach. If Emily felt like she'd lost herself, maybe I could help her find her way back. I wasn't going to let some half-baked self-discovery experiment derail our marriage without a fight. So, I made her breakfast, pancakes, eggs, the works, and sat down with her at the table. Emily, I said, carefully setting down her coffee, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About feeling stuck. Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything, just took a sip of coffee. I get it, I continued. Life's been on autopilot lately, and maybe I haven't been as present as I should be. But we can fix this together. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's sweet, Mike. But it's not that simple. Why not? I pressed. We've got everything we need right here. You don't need some outside perspective to rediscover yourself. We can make time for each other, go on dates, take a weekend trip, whatever it takes. Her expression hardened, and she set her cup down with a clink. Mike, this isn't about us. It's about me. You can't just fix me with pancakes and a vacation. I need space to figure things out. Those words stung. What the fuck she was talking about? But instead of getting angry, I decided to give her what she was asking for, space. I stopped pushing her to explain herself and started focusing on the things I could control. I made more time for the kids, something I'd been neglecting. We had movie nights, built Legos, and even took a spontaneous trip to the zoo one Saturday. Emily came along, but she was distant, like her body was there, but her mind was miles away. I also started paying attention to the little things I'd ignored for years. I noticed how tired she looked in the mornings, how she'd sigh when she thought no one was watching, how she seemed more alive when she was on her phone than when we were sitting together. Something was definitely going on. Emily's errands became more frequent. Every other day, it seemed, she'd leave the house with a vague excuse and come back hours later with a bag of groceries or a new book. When I asked where she'd been, she'd brush me off with the same tired answer. Just out. One afternoon, while she was gone, Ethan came up to me with a question I didn't know how to answer. Dad, why does Mom seem so sad all the time? That one hit me like a freight train. She's just tired, buddy, I said, ruffling his hair. She's been busy lately. He nodded, but his little face stayed scrunched in confusion. You should give her flowers. That always makes her happy. The simplicity of his suggestion gutted me. When was the last time I'd done something as basic as bringing Emily flowers? That evening, I took Ethan's advice. On my way home from work, I picked up a bouquet of her favorite lilies and walked through the front door with a renewed sense of determination. But the house was quiet. Too quiet. Sophie? Ethan? I called out. We're in here, Sophie yelled from the living room. The kids were fine, sprawled out on the couch watching TV. But Emily was nowhere to be found. Where's your mom? She went out, Sophie said without looking up. When? Like an hour ago, she replied, her tone casual. I stood there, flowers in hand, wondering where the hell my wife was. When Emily finally came home, The kids were in bed, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, the bouquet now wilted and forgotten. She walked in with her usual nonchalance, carrying a shopping bag that looked suspiciously empty. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She hesitated for just a second before answering. "Book club." I raised an eyebrow. "You joined a book club?" She nodded. "Yeah, a few weeks ago. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while." "Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged. "I didn't think you'd care." There it was again, that wall she kept putting up between us. "I care, Emily," I said, leaning forward. "But I feel like you're keeping me at arm's length. If something's going on, just tell me." Her eyes darted away, and for a moment, I thought she might finally open up. But then she shook her head. "Nothing's going on, Mike. I'm fine. We're fine. Can we not do this tonight?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something about the way she said, "We're fine," that didn't sit right with me. It felt rehearsed, like she'd been telling herself the same thing over and over until she almost believed it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized how far apart we drifted. We used to talk about everything, dreams, fears, even the little annoyances of the day. Now, it felt like we were living on opposite sides of a canyon, shouting across the void, but never really hearing each other. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. But I did know one thing. I wasn't giving up. The day started like any other. Ethan was wrestling with the zipper on his backpack while Sophie begged for a ride to school because it was too cold to walk. Emily sat at the table sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone, as distant as ever. I should have been used to it by now, the invisible wall between us, but that morning something shifted. As Emily got up to clear her mug, she accidentally knocked her phone off the table. It clattered to the floor, and she quickly bent to grab it. Her hands fumbled, and I saw something flash across her face, panic. "Everything okay?" I asked, watching her closely. She forced a smile, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. "Yeah, fine. Just clumsy today." It was nothing, or at least, it should have been. But the look in her eyes stuck with me. That afternoon, I was cleaning up the bedroom while Emily was out at book club, again. As I tossed the pile of laundry onto the bed, I noticed something sticking out from under the corner of her nightstand. It was a notebook, a small, leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. Now, I'm not the type to snoop. I've always respected Emily's privacy. But something about that morning, the way she clutched her phone like it held the world's secrets, made me pause. I picked up the journal and flipped it open, telling myself I was just curious. The first few pages were nothing unusual, random to-do lists, grocery notes, the kind of mundane stuff you'd expect. But as I kept flipping, my heart stopped. March 3rd. I met him today. I wasn't planning to, but it just happened. He's easy to talk to, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was really listening. It's probably harmless. Probably. My hand started to shake. I turned the page. March 15th. I know I shouldn't have gone to lunch with him, but I couldn't help myself. It felt good to laugh again. To feel wanted. I don't know what I'm doing, but it's like I'm waking up after being asleep for so long. The words blurred as I stared at the page. Him. Who the hell was him? By the time Emily got home, I was pacing the living room, the journal clutched in my hand like it might combust at any second. She walked in, humming softly, and froze when she saw me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile faltering. I held up the notebook. "This. Care to explain?" Her face went pale. "Mike, where did you find that? Does it matter?" I shot back. "What the hell is this, Emily? Who's him?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes darting toward the door like she was considering bolting. "It's not what you think," she said finally. I laughed bitterly. "Oh, really? Because it sounds a lot like you've been meeting someone behind my back." "It's not like that," she insisted, her voice trembling. "He's just someone I talk to. That's all." "Just someone you talk to," I said, shaking the journal. "You're writing about feeling wanted and waking up like this is some kind of Hallmark movie. What kind of married woman writes that about just someone?" She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "It's my therapist," she blurted out. I froze. "Your therapist?" "Yes," she said, her voice rising. "His name is David. He's been helping me work through everything. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me you were in therapy?" "Because it's personal, Mike," she snapped. "It's the one thing that's just mine. I needed a place where I could talk about how I'm feeling without worrying about how it would affect you or the kids." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something didn't add up. "If it's just therapy, why write about feeling wanted? That's not exactly professional, is it?" She looked away, biting her lip. "I didn't mean it like that. It's just, he understands me in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. It's not romantic, I swear." I didn't know what to believe. Was she telling the truth? Or was this therapist something more? "Fine," I said finally, setting the journal down. "If it's not romantic, then you won't mind if I come to one of your sessions." Her head snapped up. "What?" "You heard me," I said. "If this is all above board, you shouldn't have a problem with me sitting in. I want to know who this guy is." She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape route. "That's not how therapy works, Mike." "Maybe not," I said, crossing my arms. "But this isn't just about you anymore. You don't get to shut me out while I sit here wondering what the hell is going on." Emily didn't agree to let me sit in on a session, but something about her reaction made me more determined than ever to get to the bottom of it. The next day, while she was out, I called the counseling center where she volunteered and asked about David. "David? I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name here," the receptionist said cheerfully. My stomach dropped. If David wasn't a therapist, then who was he? My heart raced as I hung up the phone. If David wasn't a therapist, then Emily was lying. Again. The journal entries, her evasive answers, her refusal to let me sit in on a session, it all pointed to one thing. There was more to this than she was letting on. But who was David? I stared at the journal sitting on the coffee table, flipping through it again, searching for any detail I might have missed. The name, David, popped up a few more times, always vague. Lunches, conversations, deep talks. Nothing concrete, nothing that explained why she felt the need to keep him a secret. Frustration bubbled to the surface. If Emily wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I debated for hours before finally deciding to do something I'd never done in our 18 years of marriage: check her phone records. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but at this point, privacy wasn't exactly a two-way street. She had her secrets, and I wasn't going to sit in the dark while she kept spinning lies. Logging into our shared phone account, I scrolled through her call log. Most of the numbers were familiar: friends, family, the kids' schools. But one number stood out. It had appeared nearly every day for the past 3 months, often late at night or during her errands. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number, half expecting it to go straight to voicemail. Instead, it rang twice before a man's voice answered. "Hello?" For a moment I froze. What was I even going to say? Hi," I stammered. "I was trying to reach David?" There was a pause. Then, Who's this? I felt a flash of anger at his defensive tone. This is Mike, Emily's husband. The line went quiet. I could hear faint background noise, traffic, maybe a radio, but no response. Hello? I pressed. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but guarded. Look, I think you have the wrong number. And just like that, he hung up. When Emily got home that evening, I was waiting for her in the living room, the journal in one hand and my phone in the other. We need to talk, I said, my voice clipped. She set her bag down, her eyes darting nervously to the journal. What now, Mike? David, I said bluntly. Who is he? Her face flushed, and she crossed her arms defensively. I told you, he's my therapist. Stop lying to me, I snapped. I called the counseling center. They don't have a David on staff. And I called his number. He hung up the second I said your name. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But then her expression hardened. You had no right to do that, she said, her voice rising. Do you even hear yourself? You're spying on me, Mike. Checking my phone records, calling random numbers. What's next? Installing cameras? I wouldn't have to if you weren't sneaking around and lying to my face. I shot back. Her jaw tightened, and she shook her head. I can't do this right now. She turned to leave, but I wasn't letting her off the hook that easily. Emily, I shouted, following her into the kitchen. You don't get to walk away from this. Not this time. Who is David? Are you having an affair? She spun around, her eyes blazing. No, Mike. I'm not having an affair. But you wouldn't believe me even if I was telling the truth, would you? That's because you haven't told the truth in months. We stood there, glaring at each other, the air between us thick with tension. Finally, she broke the silence. David is a friend, she said quietly. Someone I met through the counseling center. He's been helping me figure things out. I narrowed my eyes. Helping you figure things out? Or helping you leave this marriage? Her silence said everything I needed to know. The next morning, I was still stewing when Sophie walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Dad, why were you and Mom yelling last night? My stomach dropped. We'd always been careful to shield the kids from our arguments, but this time we'd slipped. It's nothing, sweetheart, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just grow-up stuff. She frowned, not buying it. Is everything okay? Mom seems different. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything was fine. But I couldn't lie to her. Not like Emily had been lying to me. We're figuring some things out, I said carefully. But don't worry. We both love you and Ethan very much. She nodded, but her worry was obvious. And in that moment, I realized just how much damage Emily's self-discovery was causing, not just to me, but to our family. If Emily wasn't going to come clean, I'd find another way. I needed to know who this David was, why she was meeting him, and what exactly their friendship entailed. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, even paranoid, but at this point, I didn't care. I needed answers, and I was done waiting for Emily to give them to me. The PI promised to be discreet, and within a week, he'd have a full report on David, who he was, where he worked, and what, if anything, was going on between him and my wife. I just hoped I was ready for whatever he found. The private investigator, Jake, didn't waste time. By the fourth day, he called with an update. I've got something for you, Mike, he said, his voice steady. But you're going to want to see it in person. The drive to his office felt like it took hours, though it was barely 20 minutes. My heart pounded as I parked and climbed the stairs, unsure of what I was about to walk into. Jake greeted me with a nod and handed me an envelope. Take a look. It's unusual. My fingers shook as I opened the envelope and pulled out a photo. It wasn't what I expected. There was Emily, sitting at an outdoor cafe. Across from her sat a man, presumably David. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a suit that screamed money. They weren't holding hands or leaning in close. In fact, their body language seemed professional. But it wasn't the man that caught my attention. It was the third person in the frame. A teenage boy, maybe 16, sat next to David, his head down, focused on his phone. He looked a lot like Emily, too much like Emily. My stomach flipped as the pieces started to fall into place. "What's this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Jake shrugged. "That's who she's been meeting. They've had lunch 3 times this week. Nothing romantic. No touching. Mostly talking." I stared at the photo, my mind racing. Who was the boy? And why did he look so much like my wife? "Find out who they are," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Jake nodded. "I'll dig deeper. Give me a couple of days." That evening, I couldn't focus. Every time I looked at Emily, all I could see was the boy in the photo. She must have noticed something was off because she approached me after the kids were in bed. "You've been quiet," she said, her tone cautious. "I've got a lot on my mind," I replied, not meeting her eyes. She hesitated, then placed a hand on my arm. "Mike, I know things have been tense between us, but I promise there's nothing for you to worry about." I looked at her then, really looked at her. Did she believe that? Or was she trying to convince herself as much as me? "Emily," I said carefully, "is there something you need to tell me? About anyone in your life?" Her expression didn't change, but I noticed the slight twitch in her fingers, the way her eyes darted away. "No," she said quickly. "Why?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Just wondering." Her smile was tight, forced. "You're overthinking things again, Mike. Everything's fine." 2 days later, Jake called again. "You'd better sit down for this one," he said. When I arrived at his office, he handed me another envelope, this time filled with documents. "David runs a private practice," Jake explained. "Mostly legal consulting. The boy? His name's Ryan. He's 16. "Okay," I said slowly. "But why does he look like Emily?" Jake sighed and slid another piece of paper across the desk. "A birth certificate. Ryan's mother is listed as Emily Saunders," he said. "Maiden name, Prescott." The air left my lungs. "That's my wife's maiden name." Jake nodded. "Ryan's father? David Harper. Looks like your wife, and this guy had a history. And not a short one." I stared at the document, my mind spinning. A son? She had a son? I didn't wait for Emily to get home. I called her and told her to meet me at the house immediately. My tone must have alarmed her because she didn't argue. When she walked in, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the birth certificate in front of me. "What's this, Emily?" I asked, holding it up. Her face went pale. "Mike, I can explain." "You'd better," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You've got a son? And you didn't think that was something I should know about?" Tears filled her eyes, and she sank into the chair across from me. "It's not what you think." "Oh, really?" "Because it looks like you've been sneaking off to have lunches with your ex, and the son you never told me existed." She shook her head, wiping at her face. "I didn't know how to tell you. Ryan, he's from before us, Mike. I was young, and I wasn't ready to be a mom. David and I agreed that he'd raise Ryan, and I'd stay out of his life." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "You've been hiding this for 18 years? "It wasn't hiding," she said, her voice pleading. I thought it was the right thing to do. But a few months ago, David reached out. Ryan wanted to meet me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to hurt you or the kids. I stood up, pacing the room. So you just went behind my back? Lied to me? Let me think you were having an affair. I wasn't trying to lie, she said softly. I was trying to protect everyone. Protect us? I snapped. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To our marriage? Emily sat there, silent, as I paced. The weight of her secret crushed the air between us. I couldn't wrap my head around it. This woman I thought I knew better than anyone had been hiding an entire life from me. Mike, she said finally, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. But I need you to understand. I never stopped loving you. This doesn't change that. I stopped and looked at her, my chest tight with anger and hurt. You don't get to decide what changes things, Emily. You spent months lying to me, sneaking around, making me feel like I was losing my mind. And for what? To protect a lie you've been carrying for nearly 2 decades? She didn't answer, just buried her face in her hands. And for the first time, I didn't know if we'd ever recover from this. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. Emily sat at the table, her face buried in her hands, while I stood across the room, my fists clenched at my sides. I'd spent the last few weeks questioning her honesty, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. You let me think you were cheating, I said, my voice breaking the stillness. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Her head shot up, her tear-streaked face a mix of guilt and frustration. I didn't let you think anything, Mike. You jumped to conclusions because you didn't trust me. Didn't trust you? I snapped, slamming my hand on the counter. You've been sneaking around, lying about where you've been, hiding an entire child from me. What part of that is supposed to inspire trust, Emily? She flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. I was too angry to hold back anymore. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just trying to figure it all out before I told you. I didn't want to burden you with something that didn't involve you. Didn't involve me? I laughed bitterly. You're my wife. Everything about you involves me, whether you like it or not. She stood then, her chair scraping against the floor. You don't understand, Mike. I was 19, scared, and alone. David promised me he'd take care of everything, and I believed him. I buried that part of my life because I thought it was the only way to move forward. I didn't know Ryan would want to meet me someday. I didn't think it would matter after all these years. Well, guess what? I said, my voice rising. It matters now. It matters a hell of a lot. Our argument was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I turned to see Sophie standing there, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Mom? Dad? What's going on? Emily wiped her face quickly, trying to compose herself. It's nothing, sweetie. Go back to bed. It doesn't sound like nothing, Sophie said, her voice trembling. Are you guys getting a divorce? My heart broke at her words, and I immediately softened. No, honey. We're just having a grown-up conversation. Everything's fine. She didn't look convinced, but after a moment, she nodded and trudged back upstairs. When I turned back to Emily, her face was pale. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, she said. And yet, here we are, I replied coldly. I sat down across from her, the anger in my chest tempered by exhaustion. Tell me everything, I said. No more half-truths, no more excuses. I want to know everything about Ryan, about David, about why you kept this from me. Start at the beginning. Emily hesitated, her fingers twisting together nervously. But finally she nodded. David and I met in college, she began. He was older, already working while I was still in school. We dated for about a year, and then I got pregnant. He didn't want kids, but I couldn't go through with, you know? I nodded stiffly, encouraging her to continue. After Ryan was born, David convinced me that the best thing for everyone was for him to raise Ryan on his own. He had money, stability, and I was just a scared kid with no idea how to be a mom. So I agreed. I signed away my parental rights, and he promised to give Ryan the life I couldn't. Her voice cracked, and she looked down at the table. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Mike. But I thought it was the right thing. I never expected it to come back to haunt me. Haunt you? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You don't get to play the victim here, Emily. You made a choice, and then you lied to me about it for 18 years. It wasn't a lie, she said desperately. It just never came up. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Didn't matter? I stood, pacing the room again. You have a son, Emily. A son who clearly wants a relationship with you. And you've been meeting him behind my back instead of telling me the truth. How can you expect me to trust you after this? She didn't respond, and her silence spoke volumes. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red and puffy. I'm sorry, Mike. I know I should have told you. But now that it's out, I need to ask you for something. I crossed my arms. What? Ryan wants to meet the kids, she said softly, and I want to introduce him. I stared at her, stunned. You're kidding, right? She shook her head. He's their half-brother. He deserves to know them. I felt the blood drain from my face. You've got to be kidding me, Emily. You want to drop this bomb on Sophie and Ethan after everything else? Do you even realize how much damage this could do to them? They'll handle it better than you think, she said. They're stronger than you give them credit for. I shook my head, my anger surging again. Unbelievable. You've already turned our lives upside down, and now you want to drag the kids into this mess? No, absolutely not. Emily stood, her jaw set with determination. This isn't just your decision, Mike. They're my kids too. And I'm not going to deny Ryan the chance to know his family. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I wondered if this was the beginning of the end. I didn't know what was more broken, our marriage, or the trust we'd spent nearly 2 decades building. The conversation about Ryan had left me emotionally drained. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying Emily's words over and over. Introducing Ryan to our kids? It felt impossible, like trying to mend a broken vase with duct tape. But as much as I hated the idea, I couldn't ignore one simple truth: he was their half-brother. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing on the coffee table. It was Jake, the private investigator. Mike, he said, his voice tense. You need to come down to my office. Now. What is it? I asked, sitting up. I found something about David. And it's big. The drive to Jake's office felt surreal. What else could there possibly be? Emily already had a secret son. What more could this man have uncovered? When I walked into his office, Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a folder and leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction. Inside were documents, emails, legal filings, financial statements, all connected to David Harper. But one file stood out, a lawsuit filed against David by a former employee. Read the highlighted section, Jake said. My eyes scanned the page, and my blood ran cold. The plaintiff alleges that Mr. Harper orchestrated a fraudulent financial scheme, embezzling funds from company accounts and diverting them into private offshore accounts. I looked up at Jake, confused. What does this have to do with Emily? Jake pointed to another document. Check this out. It was a bank statement, an account under Emily's maiden name. And it wasn't empty. It had over $200,000 in it. My head spun. What is this? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Jake said. But it looks like David has been funneling money into this account for years. The question is, does Emily know about it? I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities. Had Emily been involved in David's schemes? Or was this something he'd done behind her back? Either way, it was clear this wasn't just about Ryan anymore. When I walked through the front door, Emily was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables like nothing was wrong. "Hey," she said, glancing up. "Did you sleep okay?" I dropped the folder on the counter. "We need to talk." Her eyes flicked to the folder, and for the first time, I saw real fear on her face. "What's that?" "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. "Because it looks like David's been sending money to an account in your name for years. Care to explain?" Her knife clattered onto the cutting board, and she took a step back. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Emily," I snapped, my voice echoing through the room. "There's a bank account. 200 grand. Your name. David's money. What the hell is going on?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. "I didn't know about the money," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear, Mike, I didn't." "Then why is it in your name?" I demanded. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. David must have done it without telling me. I haven't spoken to him about anything financial since Ryan was born." I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was lying. "So you're telling me he's been using your name to hide stolen money, and you had no idea?" "Yes," she cried. "Why would I lie about this? You think I'd risk everything, our family, for him?" Before I could respond, Emily's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, and her face turned a shade whiter. "It's David," she whispered. "Answer it," I said, my voice cold. She hesitated, but after a moment, she picked up the phone and put it on speaker. "Emily," David's smooth voice said, "we have a problem." "Do we?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," he replied. "I think Mike's been digging around. If he's found out about the account, you need to keep him calm. We can't afford for this to blow up right now." My blood boiled. "I'm right here, David," I said, my voice venomous. There was a pause, and then David chuckled. "Aw, Mike. I was wondering when you'd show up." "You're damn right I've shown up," I said, gripping the counter. "And you've got 5 seconds to explain why you've been sending my wife stolen money." David sighed, his tone suddenly icy. "You really want the truth, Mike? Fine. Emily didn't just agree to let me raise Ryan. She agreed to keep her mouth shut about some questionable business practices. That account? It's her cut of the deal." I turned to Emily, my heart shattering. "Is that true?" "No," she cried. "Mike, I swear, I didn't know." "She knew," David said smugly. "She always knew." Emily's face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. "I didn't know, Mike. I didn't know." But I couldn't hear her anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in, and my chest felt like it might explode. Everything I thought I knew about my wife, about our life, was a lie. And now, I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at Emily as she crumbled on the kitchen floor. Her sobs echoed in the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to move or speak. My mind was racing too fast to focus on her tears. "Mike," she whimpered, looking up at me, her face streaked with mascara and regret. "You have to believe me. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't." "Stop," I said sharply, my voice louder than I intended. "Just stop." She froze, her mouth open as if she had more to say, but I didn't want to hear it. Not now. Maybe not ever. Before I could think of what to say next, Ethan ran into the room, his little face scrunched with concern. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" he asked, clutching his stuffed dinosaur like it was his only lifeline. Emily quickly wiped her face, trying to compose herself. "Nothing, sweetie. Go back to your room, okay?" But Ethan wasn't buying it. His wide eyes darted between us, lingering on the tension in the air. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "It's nothing for you to worry about," I said, forcing my voice to be calm. "Your mom and I are just having a grown-up conversation." Sophie appeared in the doorway next, her face pale. "You guys are fighting again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily and I exchanged a look, and for the first time, I saw the same guilt in her eyes that was eating me alive. We'd kept the kids out of this mess for as long as possible, but now it was spilling over, and there was no way to contain it. "Come on," Emily said, her voice trembling as she ushered the kids back upstairs. "We'll talk later." When she returned, she looked exhausted. Her shoulders were slumped, and she avoided my gaze. "We need to figure this out," she said quietly. "Figure what out?" I snapped, unable to keep the venom from my voice. "The fact that you've been keeping secrets from me for nearly 2 decades? Or that you might be involved in some kind of financial crime?" Her face twisted in pain. "I'm telling you the truth, Mike. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know what David was doing. And you expect me to believe that?" I asked, shaking my head. "You expect me to believe you didn't notice $200,000 sitting in an account under your name?" "I never checked," she said desperately. "I never thought." "That's the problem," I interrupted. "You didn't think." The next day, Jake came to the house with more information. He looked grim as I let him in and sat him down in the living room. "I dug deeper into David's finances," he said, pulling out a stack of papers. "This guy's in deep. Embezzlement, money laundering, you name it. And that account in Emily's name? It's just one of dozens he's used to move funds around. If he goes down, and he will, anyone connected to those accounts is going with him." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're saying Emily could be charged with something?" Jake nodded. "It's possible. If the authorities think she was complicit, they won't hesitate to come after her." Emily, who had been sitting silently on the couch, burst into tears. "I didn't do anything wrong," she cried. "I didn't know." Jake looked at her sympathetically but didn't sugarcoat it. "Ignorance doesn't always hold up in court. You need to be prepared." After Jake left, Emily and I sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on us. Finally, she spoke. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "But we can't just sit here and wait for the hammer to drop. I could talk to David," she suggested. "Maybe he can explain." "No," I said firmly. "You're not going near him. For all we know, he's already trying to cover his tracks. You don't think he'd throw you under the bus to save himself?" She didn't respond, but the fear in her eyes told me she knew I was right. "We need a lawyer," I said. "And we need to figure out how to protect ourselves and the kids from whatever's coming." Later that night, as I was going through the documents Jake had left, something caught my eye. One of the email chains between David and an unknown recipient referenced a Plan B involving Emily. "If she won't cooperate, we move forward with Plan B. She'll have no choice but to come around." My stomach twisted. What the hell was Plan B? I showed the email to Emily, and her face went white. "I don't know what that means," she said, her voice shaking. "I think you do," I said, narrowing my eyes. "And I think it's time you start telling me everything." She hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes again. "There's something else," she said finally. I felt my pulse quicken. "What?" "David asked me to open that account years ago," she admitted. He said it was for Ryan's college fund. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and I clenched my fists. "You didn't think," I repeated bitterly. She looked at me, pleading. "Mike, I didn't know this would happen. I thought I was helping Ryan. I swear, I didn't know he was using me." I stared at her, the anger and betrayal swirling in my chest. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about Emily's choices, her lies, and the fact that she'd put our family in jeopardy without even realizing it. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. The tension in the house was unbearable. Emily and I barely spoke, except to argue or exchange cold, clipped sentences about the kids. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about the email referencing Plan B. What else was David planning? Jake's warning replayed in my mind. If David goes down, anyone connected to those accounts is going with him. But what if David wasn't going down? What if he had a way out, and Emily was part of it? 2 days later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man in a dark suit standing on the porch. "Mr. Saunders?" he asked. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "I'm Agent Keller, FBI," he said, flashing his badge. "We need to talk about your wife." My stomach dropped. "What about her?" He glanced past me into the house. "May I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Emily was in the living room, and when she saw the agent, her face went pale. "Mrs. Saunders," he said, nodding, "we have reason to believe you may have been unknowingly involved in a financial crime orchestrated by David Harper. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Emily's voice trembled. I didn't know anything about that." Agent Keller raised an eyebrow. "You have a joint account with Mr. Harper containing over $200,000. Are you saying you were unaware of these funds?" Her eyes darted to me, panic written all over her face. "It was supposed to be for my son," she said quietly. "For Ryan's college fund. Did you ever question why Mr. Harper was depositing such large sums of money into this account?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. I trusted him." Before the agent could ask another question, Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mom? Dad? Who's that?" Emily wiped her face quickly, trying to compose herself. "It's nothing, sweetie. Go back to your room." But Sophie didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the agent, her face a mix of curiosity and fear. "Is Mom in trouble?" she asked. "No," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Agent Keller turned to Emily. "Mrs. Saunders, we're conducting an ongoing investigation. If you're willing to cooperate, it could go a long way toward clearing your name." After the agent left, Emily collapsed onto the couch, shaking. "What are we going to do, Mike?" "We're going to figure this out," I said, though I didn't have a clue how. Later that night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Emily wasn't going to give me the full truth, I'd find it myself. I dug through the pile of documents Jake had given me, searching for anything that might connect the dots. And then I found it, a second email chain between David and another unknown recipient. The subject line read, "Final steps for Saunders family." My blood ran cold as I read the messages. "Once Emily is implicated, we'll have leverage. She'll have no choice but to transfer the remaining funds. After that, it's done." Leverage? What leverage? What remaining funds? I confronted Emily again the next morning, this time holding the emails in my hand. "What is this?" I demanded, shoving the papers in front of her. She scanned the messages, her face contorting with confusion and fear. "I don't know," she said. "I swear, Mike, I don't know what he's talking about." "Leverage," I repeated. "David's using you, Emily. But for what? What does he have on you?" Her hands trembled as she set the papers down. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to make sense of it all. David was playing a dangerous game, and somehow, Emily and I were his pawns. That evening, Jake called with another update. Mike, he said, his tone urgent, I've got something big. I pulled David's travel records, and he's been making frequent trips to offshore locations. But that's not all. What else? I asked, my chest tightening. He's been using another account to funnel money to someone else, someone in your wife's family. My grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? Emily's brother, Jake said. Ryan's uncle. Looks like he's been in on this from the start. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Emily didn't have just one secret. She had a whole web of them, and I was caught in the middle. When I confronted Emily about her brother, she broke down completely. I didn't know, she sobbed. I haven't talked to him in years. I didn't know he was involved. But her tears didn't move me this time. You've been lying to me for years, Emily, I said coldly. At this point, I don't know what to believe anymore. She looked at me, her face pale and desperate. Mike, please. You have to believe me. I'm not the bad guy here. But the truth was, I wasn't sure who the bad guy was anymore, or if I'd ever find a way out of this mess. Every conversation with Emily felt like a battle, every glance filled with suspicion. I could barely look at her without wondering what else she was hiding. But the worst part was that I still cared. Despite everything, part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that we could somehow get through this. That hope came crashing down one Thursday evening. I'd been going through more of the documents Jake gave me when I came across a receipt for a luxury hotel in the city. The date? Just 2 weeks ago, on a night Emily had told me she was at book club. My hands trembled as I stared at the receipt. A hotel? Why would she need a hotel? There was only one answer. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I went into detective mode. I called the hotel, pretending to confirm a reservation. The receptionist was polite and helpful. Yes, we have that record. A suite booked under the name David Harper. I swallowed hard. Was there anyone else staying with him? I'm sorry, the receptionist said. I can't release that information without authorization. I hung up, my mind racing. David. It was always David. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place. Emily's secrecy, her emotional distance, the journal entries, and now this. That night, I waited until the kids were in bed before confronting her. Where were you 2 weeks ago? I asked, standing in the doorway of the living room. Emily looked up from her book, startled. What do you mean? 2 weeks ago, I said again, my voice cold. The night you said you were at book club. Where were you really? Her face went pale. Mike, don't lie to me. I snapped, throwing the receipt onto the coffee table. I know you were at a hotel. With David? Her jaw dropped as she stared at the receipt. Mike, it's not what you think. Oh, it's not. I interrupted, my voice rising. Because it looks exactly like what I think. You've been meeting him, sneaking around, and now this? A hotel room? What were you doing, Emily? Reading self-help books together? Tears filled her eyes, but I was too angry to care. Mike, please. Let me explain, she said, her voice trembling. Then explain. I yelled. Tell me why my wife of 18 years is sneaking off to a hotel with another man. She stood, clutching the back of the couch for support. I went to see him because of Ryan, she said quickly. He wanted to talk about how we should tell him about our family. That's all it was. I swear. Do you take me for an idiot? I said, my voice shaking with anger. You don't need a hotel room for that. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Nothing happened, Mike. I would never. Stop lying to me. I roared, slamming my fist on the coffee table. I know about the money. I know about the hotel. I know about everything, Emily. Her sobs grew louder, but she didn't say another word. And that silence was all the confirmation I needed. I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the house, my heart pounding with rage and betrayal. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my head, but nothing worked. When I finally returned home, the house was dark and silent. Emily was asleep in the guest room, her face still streaked with tears. I stood in the doorway, staring at her. The woman I'd loved for nearly 2 decades was a stranger now, and I didn't know if we could ever find our way back. The next morning, while Emily was dropping the kids off at school, I opened her laptop. She'd been careless, leaving it on the kitchen counter. Her email was still logged in. I scrolled through her messages, my heart sinking with every click. And then I found it. An email from David. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Same time next week? The room spun as I read the words again and again. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical. My wife had crossed the line I'd been praying she wouldn't. When Emily returned home, I was waiting for her in the living room, the laptop open on the coffee table. Care to explain this? I asked, my voice cold. She froze, her face draining of color as she saw the email. Mike, don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't even try to lie. It's all right here. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she didn't argue. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry? I laughed bitterly. You're sorry? That's all you have to say? Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't care. How long? I demanded. 2 months, she admitted. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. 2 months, I repeated, my voice hollow. 2 months of sneaking around, lying to my face, destroying our family, for him? She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. And just like that, everything we'd built was gone. The revelation shattered something deep inside me. Emily's quiet confession of her affair with David wasn't just a betrayal. It was the death of the life I thought we had. But as the hours ticked by, a strange calm washed over me. The shouting, the accusations, the endless unraveling, it all felt pointless now. What was left to save? What was left to fight for? That night, while Emily stayed holed up in the guest room, I made my decision. The next morning, I called my attorney. I need to protect my kids, my assets, and my sanity, I said bluntly. We spent hours mapping out the next steps, freezing joint accounts, securing custody arrangements, and preparing for what would inevitably become a nasty legal battle. I couldn't trust Emily anymore, not with my life, and certainly not with the kids. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. By the time Emily realized what was happening, it was too late. She came downstairs as I packed an overnight bag, her face pale and drawn. Mike, what are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling. Leaving, I said simply. I've already contacted a lawyer. You'll hear from them soon. Her hand shot out, grabbing my arm. Please, Mike, don't do this. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, rebuild everything. Everything? I interrupted, shaking her hand off. There's nothing left, Emily. You destroyed it the moment you chose him. Her sobs filled the room, but I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a cold, unshakable resolve. I kissed Sophie and Ethan goodbye while they were still sleeping, whispering promises that I'd see them soon. I left a note on the kitchen table, not for Emily, but for them. No matter what happens, I will always love you both. Dad. As I walked out the door, I didn't look back. I didn't go far, just to a friend's house on the other side of town. Tom, my retired neighbor, welcomed me with open arms and a stocked fridge. "You're doing the right thing," he said as I unpacked. "Sometimes you have to burn the bridge to save yourself." Over the next few weeks, Emily's desperation grew. She sent me endless texts and emails, begging for forgiveness, promising she'd end things with David, claiming she'd do whatever it takes. But I didn't reply. I wasn't interested in her promises anymore. What I didn't expect was for David to get involved. One afternoon, he called me, his smug voice grating through the receiver. "Mike, I think we can handle this like adults," he said. I laughed bitterly. "Adults? You mean the way you handled sneaking around with my wife? This doesn't have to be messy," he continued, ignoring my jab. "I care about Emily, and I want to make sure everyone comes out of this okay." "You've got some nerve," I said, hanging up before he could say another word. The divorce papers were served a week later. Emily didn't contest anything. I think she knew she had no ground to stand on. The hardest part was explaining things to the kids. Sophie cried for days, while Ethan's questions cut straight to the heart. "Why can't you and Mom just fix it?" he asked one night. I knelt in front of him, trying to find the right words. "Sometimes, buddy, grown-ups make choices that can't be undone. But that doesn't mean I don't love you and your sister with all my heart." The day the divorce was finalized, I took the kids for ice cream. It was a small thing, but it felt like a new beginning. Emily moved out of the house and into an apartment closer to her counseling center. I stayed in the home, determined to rebuild a life for me and the kids. As for David, his legal troubles eventually caught up with him. Jake tipped off the authorities, and David was indicted on charges of embezzlement and fraud. Emily wasn't implicated, but the scandal left her reputation in ruins. Months turned into a year. Life settled into a new rhythm. I focused on work, the kids, and slowly finding myself again. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sophie came out to join me. "You seem happier now," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. I smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I think I am." Because in the end, the betrayal didn't define me. The lies didn't break me. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd gained something far more important: freedom, clarity, and the chance to start over. As I looked out at the horizon, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Some bridges are meant to burn, not to destroy, but to light the way forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally heading in the right direction.